Just before sunrise on November 27th, a senior palace aide rushed into the Buckingham Palace press room with a message so abrupt that it froze every journalist in place. A Duchess of York would be removed from all remaining royal provisions, effective immediately. For a moment, the room stayed silent, and then the shock spread like a spark on dry ground. Sarah Ferguson was out, not eased out, not transitioned out, but completely cut off. What followed next was chaos, unlike anything royal reporters had witnessed in years. Phones erupted across the room. Editors issued frantic instructions, and within minutes the message reached every major network. BBC halted its scheduled broadcasts. Sky News brought in analysts in the United States. Morning anchors literally paused mid-sentence as breaking alerts flashed across their screens. One anchor summed up the mood with a single line: "This is not a clarification, this is a severing." Outside the palace gates in the cold November air, the gravel paths filled quickly as people gathered with that instinctive sense that history had just shifted. Many were older viewers who remembered Sarah as the vibrant redhead of the late 80s, the woman who tried to survive in the shadow of Diana. For them, the announcement felt surreal, almost like a chapter from decades ago had been snapped shut without warning. But this moment did not appear out of nowhere. It was not about a single misstep, a lost title, or the long shadow cast by Prince Andrew. What the palace confirmed this morning was the final result of a chain of events, stretching back years: financial strain, political pressure shifting royal priorities, and scandals that refused to stay buried. Perhaps most importantly, this was not an administrative action. It was strategic, calculated, and meant as much for foreign governments and investigators as for the British public. By 6:40 in the morning, one truth was impossible to deny: Sarah Ferguson was not simply leaving a residence, she was being forced out of an entire royal world. Stay with me, because the reason behind this abrupt move, and what Sarah plans to do next, is far more unsettling than anyone predicted. To understand why the palace acted so suddenly, we have to go back several years to a time when the warning signs surrounding Sarah Ferguson were already forming long before the public sensed anything unusual inside the royal household. Her situation was not seen as a sudden crisis, but as the slow unraveling of a woman caught between strict royal rules, growing financial pressure, and shifting political currents. When King Charles took the throne, he brought a governing style his advisors had anticipated for decades: a leaner monarchy, smaller, more focused, and far less tolerant of individuals who carried reputational risk. Under Queen Elizabeth, Sarah had always been an exception. She was welcomed at family events, allowed to remain at royal lodge alongside Prince Andrew, and treated gently despite repeated controversies. The world Charles inherited was far less forgiving. Online scrutiny intensified, political pressure grew, and the institution could no longer afford what one senior aide quietly described as nostalgic allowances. Further complexity was the uncomfortable truth about Sarah's position. Unlike Andrew, she held no title of Her Royal Highness. Unlike working royals, she had no public role to justify security or housing support. Unlike the newer generation, William, Catherine, and their children, she represented an older version of the monarchy weighed down by history the crown wanted to leave behind palace walls. Conversations about royal lodge began earlier than most assumed. Maintenance costs for the Windsor estate were rising. The future of Grace and Favour residences came under review, and the legal structure tying Andrew to the property grew more complicated. Each time the matter returned, Sarah's name surfaced as a problem the institution could no longer ignore. Without an HRH, without duties, and without a defined role, she stood as an anomaly in a system built entirely on hierarchy. But it was not just tradition and cost that fueled the shift. By late 2022, political figures in Westminster began quietly pressing the monarchy to address lingering concerns linked to the Epstein fallout. The public, especially older viewers who remembered the scandals of the 90s, questioned why a nan-working royal ex-wife continued to live in a crown estate property. The palace noted the sentiment, watched the polling numbers, and saw a clear pattern: Sarah was becoming the symbol of everything the modernization plan aimed to move beyond. As legal, financial, political, and reputational pressures merged, the once quiet conversations about Sarah's future grew sharper and harder to dismiss. By the time November 27th arrived, the decision was no longer a matter of if, but when. The earliest signs of trouble did not come from headlines, they came from subtle irregularities, visible only to those who understood the system from within. And, for Catherine, whose life had been shaped by decades of protocol, records, and public duty, these early clues surrounding Sarah felt like warning bells that others refused to ignore. Began in early 2023 during a routine briefing at Kensington Palace. While reviewing her early childhood initiatives, Catherine overheard a short exchange between two staff members about the Windsor properties. One mentioned that royal lodge maintenance projections had doubled against the Others added quietly that the complication remained unchanged. Sarah was still living there, still not a working royal, and still tied indirectly to Andrew's diminishing position. Catherine said nothing. She paused for a moment, taking in the tone. When palace staff spoke with hesitation, it usually meant something larger was building behind the scenes. Few weeks later, another small inconsistency appeared. Catherine received a briefing packet, summarizing public sentiment across the different branches of the royal family. Most of it was predictable: strong support for the Wales family and cautious but steady confidence in King Charles and his plans to modernize the monarchy. But one chart stopped Hera. Sharp rise in negative sentiment surrounding the York household, not directed at Beatrice or Eugenie, who remained well-liked and largely private, but aimed directly at Sarah. Language in the analysis was unmistakable: public perception reflects unresolved associations and outdated expectations. Catherine understood it immediately. People were questioning why Sarah continued living on crown property without a defined role. As controversies continued to accumulate, her concern deepened when she reviewed a cross-Atlantic poll from the United States among viewers over 50, a generation that had watched Diana and Sarah rise side by side. Nearly half expressed confusion or disapproval over the lack of clarity around the York family's living arrangements. Especially older ones appreciate clear narratives too. Them the idea of a divorced duchess living in a royal residence without an HR title made little sense, unless someone explained why, and no explanation had been offered. The moment the whispers sharpened came unexpectedly at a spring charity event. While greeting well-wishers along the rope line, an older woman leaned in and gently asked, "Dear, why is the Duchess of York still in that large house if she no longer works for the crown? It does not look quite right, does it?" Catherine replied politely with practiced diplomacy, but inside she felt a knot forming when public questions mirrored private concerns. The gap between public understanding and palace silence had grown too wide to ignore. Inside Windsor, the atmosphere around Andrew and Sarah was changing. Staff, who once described their arrangement as unusual but workable, had begun using new words. Strained, unsettled, uncertain. One evening, in June, a senior footman reported that the pair, who had usually remained cordial despite their unusual dynamic, had spent hours in separate wings of the lodge without acknowledging each other. Catherine heard this during a quiet catch-up with a trusted aide and felt a chill of unease when a household that had survived divorce, scandal, and ridicule suddenly turned cold. It suggested a structural shift rather than an emotional one. Equally troubling were the briefings about foreign media. American outlets had begun linking Sarah once again to the Epstein narrative due to past communications and the revived congressional inquiry. Catherine understood the danger. When someone became part of an international scandal discussion, the Crown reassessed the risk, and Sarah had no formal role, no institutional protection, and no functional justification to remain within the royal structure. By late summer, Catherine was given an internal document outlining external reputational threats. Sarah's name was not at the top, but it was listed prominently. The reasoning was blunt: a non-working royal with unstable finances, high visibility, and unresolved associations attracts scrutiny that conflicts with modernization goals. In royal language, that phrasing signaled the early stages of a permanent decision. Confirmation that something was deeply wrong arrived in early autumn at a small luncheon at Clarence House. Midway through the event, Princess Anne made one of her characteristically direct remarks to a senior advisor seated beside her: "If the lodge becomes a liability, it must be handled quickly. We cannot carry everyone forever." She did not mention Sarah, but she did not need to. Catherine left the luncheon with a quiet certainty: the discussion around Sarah had shifted from concern to action, and once royal machinery began moving with that purpose, it rarely slowed. No one knew then how soon that movement would turn into a decisive blow. As November approached, the conversations inside Buckingham Palace moved from subtle unease to strategic urgency. The question was no longer whether action would be taken regarding Sarah Ferguson, but how far the crown was prepared to go. At the center of this shift stood Queen Camilla, a woman who understood the fragile nature of public perception better than almost anyone. Camilla's mornings often began with thick folders of press summaries. Lately, a new pattern had emerged. American outlets were no longer focused solely on Prince Andrew. Their attention had turned to Sarah Tickles in the Washington Post. Segments on MSNBC and panel discussions on CNN began asking direct questions about why the Duchess of York continued to occupy a Crown Estate residence while carrying reputational risks tied to Andrew's scandals and her own financial problems. The tone was moving from curiosity to criticism, and for a monarchy deeply aware of international image, this was significant. Camilla called a private meeting in the green drawing room, choosing a space far from casual ears. Those invited were Sir Edward Chapman, a senior advisor with decades of crisis management experience, Fiona Lyle, a communications strategist known for sharp intuition, and Rupert Kane, a former editor who had previously guided the palace through turbulent media. Camilla opened the meeting with her usual steady calm, but the urgency behind her words was unmistakable. Public patience is not endless, she said as she tapped the edge of an article, highlighting the renewed attention on Sarah's past link to Epstein. Institutional tolerance is not endless either, Sir Edward unfolded a briefing that tracked the surge in international coverage of Sarah's financial troubles, the old message referring to Epstein as a supreme friend and the revived congressional inquiry were increasing sharply across American media. British outlets that had previously avoided pushing too hard were now presenting her continued stay at Royal Lodge as a clear contradiction within King Charles's modernization plan. Princess Anne joined the next round of conversations, bringing her usual directness. She skipped sentiment entirely. "We are trying to streamline the monarchy," she said, "not carry the entire past into the future." Anne had always respected Sarah, especially during the years when both women faced public scrutiny beside Diana, but she believed the survival of the institution depended on following rules, not memories. William, who had been briefed separately at Kensington Palace, expressed the same view in his measured, deliberate way. He understood the balance between personal loyalty and public duty more than anyone, yet he also saw the risk the monarchy could not withstand another reputational crisis, especially one indirectly tied to an ongoing international investigation. One difficult meeting, he was reported to have said, "We cannot continue carrying burdens that do not belong to the future we are building." The most revealing insight came from the palace communication wing. Analysts presented Camilla and Charles with data showing a steep rise in negative sentiment among American viewers over 50. This group, long loyal and deeply nostalgic for the Diana-era monarchy, was beginning to express open frustration over unresolved issues tied to the York family. The trend was impossible to dismiss. For the monarchy to maintain its narrative overseas, it needed to draw a clear boundary at home. During a late afternoon strategy session, a young communications staffer reviewing engagement patterns offered an observation that changed the room. "People are not watching this as royal drama," she said. "They are watching it as a moral question. How much responsibility does a family carry for the actions of someone connected to them?" The room fell silent. It was the kind of insight only someone outside decades of royal culture could voice, yet it perfectly explained why the story had become so volatile. International. Camilla and Charles reviewed the draft of the formal statement created by the legal and communications teams. It was crisp, restrained, and entirely institutional. The language clarified future arrangements regarding residence support and the larger restructuring of the market, did not mention scandals. It did not criticize Sarah, framed the decision as procedural and aligned with long-term modernization, but beneath its calm tone, anyone familiar with royal subtext could see what it meant. The crown was stepping away before final approval. Camilla made a suggestion shaped by her own experience: "We must ensure this does not appear punitive. Must read as policy." Charles agreed, and several lines were revised to emphasize neutrality and precedent rather than personal implication. As the 27th of November was selected as the release date, the atmosphere inside the palace shifted. Staff worked through the weekend preparing press briefings, legal explanations, and internal guidance for senior members of the household. A quiet understanding settled across the offices. Decision could not be undone. Its impact would echo far beyond Windsor and Buckingham Palaces. The preparations continued. A question emerged for viewers around the world: from which country or city are you watching this moment in royal history unfold? Your perspective helps show how widely this story has traveled and how differently it is understood across the globe. When the announcement finally came, the palace was ready, but no amount of preparation could soften the force of a decision that would ignite a firestorm. From London to Lisbon, from Washington to Windsor, and straight into the life Sarah Ferguson had worked for decades to rebuild. At 7:20 on the morning of November 27th, the official palace statement was released. It spread across the world within minutes. Short, polished, and unmistakably final. The Crown confirmed that, effective immediately, Sarah Ferguson would no longer receive housing support, security consideration, or transitional assistance from the royal household. Line read like a door closing for Sarah. The impact was immediate. She was seated at a small writing desk in a quiet London hotel suite when her phone lit up with alerts. She had moved there discreetly days earlier, sensing that something decisive was coming but not knowing when it would strike. She saw the Buckingham Palace header appear on her screen. She froze. She read the announcement twice, hoping perhaps the meaning would shift. It did not. What struck her first was not the loss of royal lodge that had been expected for months. It was the tone, the absence of warmth, the formality, the unmistakable signal that the crown was drawing a clear, unbridgeable line between Sarah Ferguson and the institution she had once entered through marriage. No matter the years she spent repairing her image, the charity work, the children's books, the resilience shown through public failures, none of it mattered now. In the eyes of the monarchy, she was no longer part of its future. Across newsrooms, analysts reacted with a mix of shock and grim understanding. The modernization drive under King Charles had always pointed toward a smaller and more strategically focused royal family, but no one expected the shift to fall so sharply and so publicly on the Duchess of York. The moment felt precise in its timing. Andrew was already being moved to a modest residence on the Sandringham estate. The Epstein case in the United States was gaining momentum once again, and Parliament had intensified its pressure for ethical clarity within royal circles. Many observers saw only one conclusion. Sarah had become a weight the institution no longer wished to carry. As the media storm grew louder, commentators revisited every chapter of her troubled past. Stories about her financial missteps resurfaced, including the failed Pegasus Bitcoin project. American networks replayed clips, highlighting her controversial email, describing Epstein as a supreme friend. Even her charity work, once celebrated, was now reframed as a career overshadowed by questionable associations and poor judgment. Her well-known perseverance, once admired, was retold as the struggle of a woman who had been granted multiple chances but never found stable ground. While the world focused on the spectacle, something far more intimate was happening behind the scenes. Beatrice and Eugenie, who had been monitoring the announcement from their homes, reached out to their mother within minutes. Sources close to the sisters revealed they were heartbroken but not surprised. They had been aware for weeks that the November 27th declaration would be final. Quietly and urgently, they prepared a path for her departure. Their residence in the coastal region of Comporta was set up in advance. Staff arranged temporary quarters, and trusted contacts secured privacy upon her arrival. This was not a holiday plan. This was a relocation strategy, a plan for survival inside the palace. Advisors felt a mix of relief and concern. Relief, because a long-standing institutional dilemma had at last been resolved. Concern, because Sarah was known for her unpredictability and her willingness to speak openly. A separation of this scale could lead to responses no one could forecast. Her unstable finances left her open to publishing offers. Her long connection to Andrew meant she held information that could unsettle the monarchy if ever shared. And her history of refusing to exit quietly made her future steps impossible to read for Sarah. The announcement represented far more than a political decision. It was a personal displacement. Her entire adult life had been connected in one way or another to the royal sphere, and now that tie had been severed, she folded the printed statement on her desk, pressing down its creases with slow, deliberate movements. One question echoed in her thoughts. When the crown decides your place in its narrative has ended, where does your story go next? As light spread across the London skyline, Sarah Ferguson understood that her next chapter would not begin in Britain. It would begin somewhere distant, beyond the reach of the palace. The judgment of the press, and the life she once believed, would define her future. The hours after the palace's November 27th declaration carried a sense of strain that touched every corner of the royal structure. Although the statement was delivered with restraint, the impact was anything but gentle. Inside Buckingham Palace, senior staff moved with controlled urgency, fully aware of the significance of the moment. A clear and permanent divide had been established between the Crown and the Duchess of York. Within minutes, the legal team gathered in a quiet chamber overlooking the gardens, a space typically reserved for constitutional matters rather than family crises. Yet Sarah's situation had now crossed into legal territory. They reviewed the wording of Crown estate lease agreements, the boundaries of the succession laws, and the policies governing members who do not serve as working royals. One lawyer summarized the matter with simple precision. Her royal status is gone. Her institutional support is gone. Under current statute, there is no route for return. The words were legal, not emotional. Yet the finality of the message weighed heavily even on those accustomed to strict limitations. At Windsor, the consequences were already reshaping Prince Andrew's world. The logistics team confirmed he would be moved to a smaller residence on the Sandringham estate before Christmas, a reduction described publicly as part of routine restructuring. Though everyone involved understood the deeper symbolism, Andrew would remain within the Crown's protection. Sarah would not. Their long and unusual domestic arrangement had finally reached its end, brought about not by sentiment but by policy elsewhere in Kensington Palace. William observed the unfolding events with measured calm. He had long accepted that safeguarding the institution meant accepting decisions that caused personal discomfort. Though he held no personal resentment toward Sarah, he fully understood the political risks tied to her financial struggles and her indirect connection to Andrew's controversies. Every misstep sent ripples through the monarchy, eroding public confidence and threatening the future he hoped to secure for George, Charlotte, and Louis. Those close to him noted a quiet sense of relief. An unresolved question had found its answer. Catherine's view, though expressed with less intensity, was grounded in the same realism. Catherine understood Sarah's position more deeply than most. Both women had been pushed under the relentless glare of the tabloids. Both had entered marriages that demanded perfection while offering little real protection. But Catherine also recognized a harder truth. The palace could not continue shielding someone whose presence complicated the long-term stability and modernization of the monarchy. In her eyes, allowing Sarah to step away from royal life was the only path that could sustain the institution. Even if the decision appeared cold from the outside at Clarence House and Buckingham Palace, aides began sorting through the immediate consequences. Without the backing of the institution, Sarah no longer qualified for royal security. A serious concern given renewed attention on her financial past. The Home Office clarified that she would need to manage her own protection while living abroad, and any travel to nations cooperating with ongoing United States investigations would require careful legal planning. None of these issues were theoretical. They demanded urgent answers. Meanwhile, Beatrice and Eugenie found themselves torn between loyalty to the monarchy and loyalty to their mother. They accepted the palace's reasoning, yet felt the emotional weight of the decision. Their arrangements for Sarah's move intensified. Contacts in Portugal confirmed the final details of a residence near Comporta. Trusted friends in London were quietly asked to deliver personal belongings and essential documents. The sisters worked quickly, intent on ensuring their mother had a place that felt safe and controlled. Beneath their planning lingered a deeper fear that once Sarah left the United Kingdom, her separation from the royal world might become permanent by nightfall. As light glowed behind the palace windows and winter settled over London, one truth had become unmistakable. This was not simply a change of address. This was a structural shift. Sarah Ferguson was no longer orbiting the edge of royal life. She was outside it now, looking back. And the institution, having charted its course, had no intention of reversing it. As November 27th came to an end, shock began to give way to reflection. Around the world, audiences tried to understand what Sarah's abrupt removal from royal provisions meant not only for her future but for the monarchy as a whole. In many ways, the events of the day echoed something profoundly human, a moment when the past no longer shields you and the future must be faced with new terms. Sarah's story has always been layered with contradictions. She was the lively outsider who won public affection, the duchess who endured controversy after controversy, the mother fiercely protective of her daughters, and the woman who continued to reinvent herself despite repeated setbacks. Yet when the palace drew its boundary today, it illustrated a reality larger than her story alone. Charm, endurance, and nostalgia cannot outweigh institutional priorities. Not in an era where global scrutiny is constant, and consequences are immediate. Beyond the royal framing lies a human lesson. Families change, institutions evolve, and sometimes the places we once believed would hold us forever begin to shift beneath our feet. Sarah's fall feels dramatic, but the message is universal. We cannot rely indefinitely on structures created in an earlier season of our lives. Stability has to come from accountability, choices, and the willingness to confront unresolved issues rather than hoping old privileges will carry us forward. Watching this unfold, I was reminded of how quietly unresolved problems grow until they dictate the outcome. Sarah's finances, her complicated bond with Andrew, the controversies she never fully escaped. Each issue widened slowly until the foundation gave way. That truth extends far beyond palace walls. Problems do not disappear when ignored. They gather weight until they force a reckoning. Yet there is another side to this turning point, one that carries a softer and more hopeful tone. Sarah is stepping into a new chapter, even if it arrives through pain. Reinvention often requires a break, sometimes even an involuntary one. Portugal might not have been her wish, but it offers space, distance, and the possibility of rebuilding without the heavy expectations of royal life. For a woman who lived years under fierce public scrutiny, that distance could become a kind of freedom for the monarchy. The choice marks a deliberate movement toward the vision King Charles has repeatedly articulated: a slimmer structure, clearer accountability, and a royal identity shaped for modern expectations. Whether the firmness of this decision feels harsh or necessary, it reflects an institution trying to adapt to a far more transparent world than the one it was designed for. As this chapter settles, one thought remains: power structures may enforce the rules, but individuals shape their own stories. Sarah Ferguson has been many things: spirited, controversial, resilient, unpredictable, but never silent. Now that the palace has delivered its final word, the world waits to see how she will respond, what truths she may share, and who she will become once she is no longer sheltered by the walls of Windsor. Thank you for staying through this unfolding journey. The fall of a duchess is more than a royal headline. It is a reminder of the delicate balance between consequence and reinvention, and how each of us must eventually choose which direction our own story will turn.